What I like about these shoes, if you're talking about history, what climbing was like 40 years ago at the very start of sport climbing, you can talk, you can tell stories on, or you can just hand them these shoes and that instantly they realize, whoa, that's just, it'd be like hobnail boots from my generation where you'd see something that's just obviously a whole different generation. So for me, these are just a prized possession. Probably of all the shoes I have, these are the ones that are nearest and dearest to me. These are the Chouinards, believe it or not. And I probably bought these in 1979 or something. There were all these shoes that were basically the same sort of thing. And sometimes the old shoes, they all had lug soles and heels. With some of them, the idea was they were stiff, but they'd bend a little bit at the toe, so you could kind of smear and kind of edge. And essentially what happened is you couldn't, they were terrible for everything. These, they didn't compromise. These are edging shoes. I mean, there's just a steel shank. They don't bend at all. And so these shoes really became kind of a cult item with boulderers, high-end boulderers. Like if you go to Colorado and up at Flagstaff, I mean, these were the shoes people were wearing. They weren't wearing the EBs or something else, it was just these shoes because you could stand on just the smallest little edges. And so they are archaic, but they were kind of a high-performance shoe for the right sort of climbing. And they were impossible on anything else. But so I got these shoes for bouldering, but then when I bolted a climb that came to be known as Tots, it was just these small little edges of vertical face, and the shoes like the EBs I didn't feel as good on edges. And so I think I maybe tried it with EBs once, and then I just shifted to these. And it took me quite a while to do that route. I bolted it in 1982, working on it during the summer. It was not a very good time to work on it. And then I just was climbing a whole lot and was getting better. And then early 1983, when it was cold, I went back and all of a sudden I could do the moves. And I think probably the last time I had these on my feet were when I did Tots, which is, arguably the first sport climb at Smith Rock and in the United States. I told my partner, I said, I don't think anybody's ever going to do Tots without edging shoes. You need edging shoes. And of course, the opposite was true. Nobody has ever used edging shoes ever again. At Smith, I did a lot of bouldering with these things, but I don't think I used them on any other route that I remember. I mean, they're worn. You can see there's some holes in them. But they were bouldering shoes. I don't remember why I decided that they were better on this particular route. I mean, I guess up until that point, it makes some sense because this was the first blank looking wall that is a sport route and with really small holes. And before I was doing cracks and stemming corners and freeing pin scar cracks and that sort of stuff. So it kind of seemed like these were the shoes. I mean, Tots, I can't even imagine the thousands of people who have done it. It's right there in the dehedrals. It's done all the time. It's 12B. It's a grade. There's somebody on it all the time. Every single day there's somebody on it. But it's kind of stout. People don't do it that often. I mean, people try it, but so I have no idea. It's certainly been done in the thousands of times. I mean, it's 40 years. It's been there for 40 years, and it's kind of a historic route. Yeah, you keep track of the first ascent and the second ascent, and maybe even the 10th ascent. And once you get up into the hundreds and the thousands, yeah. These are just EBs, which everybody from my generation, these were the shoes from probably the early 70s, and these were the dominant shoes. I bet you these shoes among top climbers, they probably held a 80% market share. Everybody had EBs. I went through probably 20 pairs. And I think this was my last pair that I used, because once the new technology came out, these went from being 80% market share to within a couple years, 1%, and then quickly down to 0. They're really a terrible rock shoe. They're canvas, really poorly constructed. They didn't fit very well. You can see kind of the bulge on the heel, where your heel would never stay down into the boot. So you'd have to get them really, really small. Your heel would bulge out the back. A lot of times it would bust out the back. They were flexible, but by today's standards, they're pretty stiff. But it was the rubber. The rubber was kind of built to last a long time. People weren't thinking that you needed rubber that was sticky or anything like that. Durability was a big thing. So you'd have our rubber lasts longer than our competitors' rubber. And because of that, it wasn't sticky. I mean, it wouldn't smear. I mean, they were just bad. They were just bad shoes. But I used these on everything I did at Smith Rock except for Watts Tots from maybe 1980 to the middle of 1983, and the first ascent of chain reaction at Smith. This is the very pair of shoes I wore. I'm slamming these shoes saying how bad they are, but at the time they were just the state of the art, and I loved them. They were just my go-tos for anything, and they were good on cracks, and they weren't like a specialty shoe. They were just a good all-around shoe. These shoes now, I mean, they're 40 years old, and it's funny because I've had a few people come up. I don't know if they're like sniffing my shoes, but they're like, these don't smell. They don't smell at all. And I was like, well, it's been 40 years. Like organisms, they don't live forever. Whatever made these shoes smell died decades ago. So with chain reaction, I bolted it in late January and did it like a month later. Hang dogging, working out the moves, trying to do something really, really hard. There was no such thing as an easy sport climb back then. It was always about trying to raise the level higher. But for me, chain reaction was the turning point. Before that, everything up to that, I was kind of bumbling along at Smith Rock, freeing aid climbs, doing these cracks that are just really unpleasant and gnarly and crumbly. And then I remember the day I wrapped down chain reaction, and it looked, without chalk on it, it just looked flat out impossible, especially in that era. I was wrapping down, got to the lip, and there was this big pillar of rock just kind of balanced right on the edge. And I just kicked it away, and there's a big flat jug, about this far over the lip, and brushed it off, and it's like, wow, that's great. And then I went down a little lower, and right at the lip, there was this rock that was kind of wedged in there. It's kind of loose, and I pulled it back and forth, pulled it out, and there was an absolute ink cut. And you could grab the arete, and it's like, oh my God, all of a sudden you realize that this thing would go. And for me, that moment was the moment from bridging the past and the future. Because it's like, if something like chain reaction would go free, then everything around here will go free. And that climb seemed so modern compared to, it's hard to imagine, back then climbing was just old school. Everything was old school. And so chain reaction was the first thing that was, it's still just kind of the quintessential sport climb. It's short, but it's kind of brutal, and that's what sport climbing is. So when I did this, with these shoes, I bolted it. It took me 2 days, I think, to bolt it because I was hand drilling, and it was really hard to, I was like putting in sky hooks and I think RERPs to try to hold myself into the wall because it was taking an hour to drill each hole. There were just 5 bolts, but still, it took a long time. And then I tried it, worked through the moves. I think I did the moves the first day, and then I just started working on it, trying to red point it. I would never leave quick draws behind because that was just not ethically, for whatever reason, that was not okay. Nobody left quick draws on any route at Smith until the French visited in 1986, and they were doing that. And so we decided, okay, that seems, if they're doing it and they can climb 514, then we should start doing it too. The other thing that was odd is I would try it one time each day. I wouldn't warm up. You kind of thought, a lot of people thought that any warming up would just get you kind of tired. So if you wanted to be really fresh, you just go. It'd be February and 35 degrees, go right there and just start pulling through the moves, fall off, hang, go to the anchor, lower down, pull all the gear, and walk away. One attempt per day. It never occurred to me to try it more often until I think I had been on it 5 days, maybe 6 days, and I fell off, and I was like, I don't want to wait. And then it was like, well, wait a minute, why don't I just pull the rope and try it again? But the problem was then you had quick draws hanging, and that would disqualify the ascent. So I think it was my 3rd go of my 6th day when I did it, maybe 7th day, I don't remember exactly. But when I did it, I climbed up to the first bolt, unclipped the quick draw, clipped it into my gear loop, took it off my gear loop, and then back into the bolt. And I did that for every bolt, even the one at the lip. That was just how it was done. But when that, I remember doing that and hitting that jug and pulling over. And again, that moment was probably that climb was the turning point. So, and these shoes are just, so having these shoes and that memory, you know, if I think about, if there's one climb or one image from that whole era of when sport climbing emerged, it's just chain reaction. The picture that's been taken, I can't imagine how many hundreds of thousands of times that picture has been taken.
Is it the same grade as what you graded it?
I've looked at old drawings that I had of it, and the first drawing I had, I called it Moonshine Overhang, because it was right near Moonshine Dihedral. There were only like 6 routes all traditional routes in the dihedrals at that time. But I said 512D. And I think, you know, the way I did it, there's a lot of holds around the arête that I never saw, and I just missed things. And so the sequence that was for me actually was the crux, is something that nobody falls off of. So, I mean, it probably was 12D when I did it, and it's, you know, right now, the grade, I think it got repeated like within a year, and I talked to the guy, and it's like, yeah, probably 12C. But there's a lot of good climbers who find that route really hard. So it's old school 12C, and it's held the grade, but it's really probably 12D. And again, when I wrapped it, it just seemed like, why am I even wasting my time going through the hassle of wrapping down this thing? Because it looked impossible. There was no reason to think it was possible. Once I found that pulled off that pillar where there was the finishing jug and then the hole at the lip, looking at the holes, it was pretty clear, this will go free. I was a good boulderer at that point, and so what kind of worked out well for me is before there were routes at Smith Rock, I was still climbing there every day, usually alone, and so all there was for me to do was to boulder. And so I became, you know, I wasn't good by today's standards, but I was climbing maybe V10, maybe V11, the hardest things. Once I bolted chain, I was able to do it relatively quickly because I was a good boulderer. I had put in whatever you might want to say, your 10,000 hours. I already put in that work to where I was good enough where once I started bolting them, I could do them pretty quickly. And in 83 and 84, it went from nothing to all of these iconic lines were just boom, boom, boom. And it was like the most exciting time in my life, really, because you just saw this thing. Chain reaction's one thing, but then when there's all the other faces and arêtes and nobody knows about it, it's like someday people are gonna, you know, come here and find out about this place. And it was super exciting knowing that, you know, I was onto something. I was onto something, and I was also in the process getting really, really good. Because for a while I was the only climber in the US who was a sport climber. Everybody else was doing cracks, falling off, lowering down, not hang dogging, you know, pulling the rope, all that sort of stuff. And I was just there figuring out the most efficient way to climb. So yeah, for a while it was exciting because I'd go to other areas and I'd do really well because sport climbing makes you a good climber. And then eventually other people started doing it, and then I realized, oh, okay, I'm not that great after all. It's like the tactics work. Going from the EBs to the Firays was the biggest change in footwear and climbing ever. And there'll never be anything else that even remotely approaches it. John Backer brought these into the US from Spain, I think in maybe 1982, but they really weren't available. I remember Backer visited Smith, and I, of course, saw him in Joshua Tree in Yosemite, and he had these magic shoes. And so everybody was really excited about them, but they were very hard to get. And somehow I didn't get one of the early pairs. I had a friend, Alan Lester, had a pair of shoes in maybe June of '83, and we were in Colorado, and I was trying Genesis, that famous climb in El Dorado, and there's a move on it, I don't remember what, but there's like an undercling to a side pull, like a big reach, and your foot was on this rounded knob that even back then was a sloper that was kind of greasy. And my foot, with wearing this exact pair of shoes, just kept popping off of it again and again and again. You know, trying to reach up, I don't remember exactly, it's been 40 years, but I just kept popping off again and again and again. And then Alan, he went up and he was wearing Firays, and he could do the move. And I was like, you know, it's gotta be the shoes. It's got to be the shoes. And he's like, no, it's not the shoes. It's not the shoes. I've been training, I've been working out, And it's like, you got to let me wear your shoes. And he's like, no, you're not going to wear my shoes. And eventually I convinced him to let me go up and try it. Wearing these, I go up there, very first time I try it, just boom, just reach up there, foot sticks. And for the next couple months, I did not have much desire to climb because I saw the breakthrough. And it was like climbing in these things, just like, ugh. And there were a lot of things at Smith Rock too that I had bolted, like Last Waltz and Split Image, both of them arêtes that had some blank sections, where there were moves that I could not do with these shoes. I mean, you were just smearing and the feet would skate off. But when I got these, all of a sudden, I could do the moves. The rubber is just sticky. It's just, it smears and they fit terribly. They're just kind of like these baggy shoes. They would stretch a lot. By today's standards, they're pretty terrible. They were good crack climbing shoes. I think they'd still be, with a really narrow profile, good crack climbing shoes. But it just made it seem like everything was possible all of a sudden. So again, I was fortunate because I had just got the sport climbing thing going. I was good enough to do routes that were hard enough, and then you got these shoes, and it was just, I climbed almost every day in 1984 because I was just so excited to be able to, do hard route after hard route. I don't remember exactly. I'm sure I went through a dozen pairs of these. This is just a shoe from kind of that era. I can't tie it to any particular route. These were the breakthrough. Boreal Fire, F-I-R-E. And you just can't even, anybody that from my generation that experienced that change gets kind of excited talking about what these shoes did to climbing. This is the Mariacher. Heinz Mariacher is a legendary, probably the most legendary shoemaker. This was his signature shoe, and this was probably, I imagine, in 1984 or something when he released these. The EBs, at one point, they probably had a 90% market share, and then Fires came out, and then Fires just took over, and Fires probably had a 90% market share. So there was, that was just a European shoe that was imported, so other European manufacturers wanted to get a piece of it, and Sportiva came in. And at the start, they were very, very small. But I started to wear these. They were just better at edging. The Fires were great smearing shoes, but they weren't great to be on little tiny edges on a vertical face. These things are the same sticky rubber. The rubber was just as good. They just edged better. They fit better. They were a little bit more modern. They don't look modern. They're still high tops, but they just fit the foot better, and they seemed a little more high performance. Maybe the first high performance shoe. Sometimes I would even use my left foot I would wear a Mariacher, and my right foot I would wear a Fire or that sort of thing. These shoes I used on the east face of Monkey Face, this very pair. So I did that first in 2 pitches, in a 12C pitch and like the 13C pitch. And I did the second pitch of that in 1984. And that was probably the hardest route in the US at the time. And then I put them together in a single pitch, which raised the grade 1 notch to 513D, which was certainly the hardest route in the US at the time, in 1985. And wore these and wore them on other climbs because I was, the east face was freeing an old aid line done in 1963 that had pin scars. So it was just a pin scar route, old school. There were a few bolts in places, but it was just this old school route. It was not modern, not a sport climb. But there were other routes like Rude Boys. I had bolted that and was working on that, and there was a picture of me wearing these shoes halfway up the route. Just this, this kind of this cool picture that in 1986 there was, I think it was 86, there was an article, a full Outside magazine article called King of the Hangdogs, and it was about me, the Hangdog King. And but I was wearing these shoes in that picture, and about a week later I got a call from somebody, I forget who it was, in Colorado, who had just had the rights to bring in La Sportiva. And they were like, hey, we saw that picture, and thanks for the free full-page ad in Outside, and we'd like to send you shoes. And so I then went to Sportiva was my brand, and I never, for all the years that I was a serious sponsored climber, I used Sportivas through that whole period of time. The Megas were the next shoe I used after this. I'm trying to even remember. All of a sudden there started to be so many shoes that these in 1984 still look old school. The shoes I was using in 1990 started to look a lot more like shoes today. Not downturned, but they came a long ways just in those few years. You know, the overall progression of these shoes, it's just, these were shoes that I wore doing routes from 1983 to 1985, but that was not just a turning point in you know, with the development of sport climbing, but the technology just changed massively. You went from the boots, the lug-soled boots, to sticky rubber, you know, better fitting shoes, higher performance shoes. You needed the footwear to improve. If people were still wearing those boots, climbing would be in a very different place. I wish I had my harness, because it was a Forest mountaineering harness. Forest was Bill Forrest. I don't know why, but Forrest was my first harness, and I had the same harness from like 1980 to 85. And that was like climbing, you know, 1,500 days, and it was so worn that they didn't have it. There wasn't a you know, a belay loop. There were just a couple ears that you tied into, and they were so worn that I remember when I did I see pictures of when I did the east face of Monkey Face, and I actually was wearing a 2-inch green swami that I tied around my waist, and so I would tie into both ears and the swami belt, because it became pretty obvious this thing is gonna break. This is gonna break, and it was hard to get gear. It was like, where do you get it? And you know, if it breaks, I have my swami, big deal. I wish I would have saved that harness, because it was ridiculous. Yeah, like you could just see it. The tie-ins were like halfway gone, just frayed. The old gear, I remember, I would keep lists, so I knew exactly how many carabiners I had, and I marked all my gear. I had a lot of SMC. That was a huge brand back then. I probably had more SMC carabiners than any other carabiner. But I stamped every one I had these little metal things that you'd hammer, and I put an ACW, my initials, on every piece of gear. And at one point I probably had 80 carabiners that were stamped ACW. And then I was going through all of my old stuff and going through all the old gear, and I did not have a single one left. Every single one I had left behind somewhere, or just one way or another. I have a lot of gear with my old ACW stamp, because that's back from the 70s. But I was bummed out that I didn't have a single carabiner. I thought about finding old climbing partners, and it's like, hey, go through your stuff. I want to try to find one of my carabiners. I would leave them. There were times I had some things stolen. There was one climb, it's a whole another story, but I did this route, it was probably 1979, this overhanging thing. I wasn't very good back then, and I fell off this thing, and I remember climbing up. There was this big, huge block, and you ran it out up to that block. You had to stand up on top of this. It was the second pitch of a route. You stand on top of the block, then you put in, I didn't have cams, you put in some hexes into this crack, and then there was like this 510 section. You got under a roof, and then you finished over this roof, and then it got easier. But I got all the way up, and my last gear was right at the lip of the roof, right up to the top, and the crack right at the top, it was just overgrown dirt, bushes, and poison oak. And I was run out, and I was starting to panic, and I tried to fight my way through. I tried to fight my way through the jungle, grabbing onto vines, and I fell off, holding, vines in my hand. Took this monster fall, I don't know, 40 or 50 feet, and I was just right by that big block, and I swung in because I wanted to get the weight off my harness, and I pulled rope down, and I was standing on the block, the entire block, which weighed, I'm sure a ton, collapsed right underneath me.
Oh my God.
And if it would have pulled off when I was climbing, I would have been killed. I just stood on it. And just, my partner was at the base and people were at the base, and I just rock, the loudest I've ever done in my life, and everybody was fine. And I was so rattled that I just, lower me. So I lowered down and just, I pulled the rope and abandoned every piece of gear. I was so rattled. I just left it all, thinking maybe I'll come back and get it. And a year later, when I went back, it was all gone. But I probably lost 25 carabiners, like a whole history of gear I lost at that point. But you climb for 50 years, and there was a time when I was climbing 30 days a month, 31 days every day, long days, and I was burning through shoes. Every 6 weeks or so I'd go through a pair of shoes. So I have, I don't know, maybe 100, 120 pair that I still have in this huge crate. And I've thrown out a lot of pairs because it just gets to be ridiculous. They're old and stinky, but there were just shoes that I went through and looking through, it's like, I remember this pair. I remember what I did with this pair. And so I just pulled out a few while I still remember, the significance. And so that's kind of, and I have other shoes that were older than these, a whole bunch, like the ones I started with, and because these were like shoes from, once sport climbing started. And I'd been climbing for 8 years before I ever started bolting routes. And then of course, many, many years after. So, but shoes it's a good story because now there's so many shoes, they're all great. There's just different levels, but nobody's gonna come out with a shoe breakthrough that is even remotely close to the breakthrough that we had in the 80s when we went from the old shoes, stiff lug-soled shoes, and from EBs to sticky rubber. That was the biggest change. Everybody just rose. From this level to that level, just because all of a sudden your feet stuck on holds and didn't just skate off like roller skates. Yeah, I should attach that, but shoes worn on the first ascent of chain reaction, Alan Watts, 1983. So these shoes, they actually, in Bend, it's called the High Desert Museum, and they did a whole climbing exhibit. Not just my stuff, but like way before. They got a rugby shirt from Chouinard, and they brought in all of this stuff from the American Alpine Club. It was a pretty cool exhibit, and I had one display with tights and t-shirt and the old shoes. So these things they spent like 6 months in a museum, which is funny because they were just in a bin buried in my shed, and when they asked me to find stuff, I'm just scrambling through like, what do I have? But then I thought, if they were in a museum, I should label them and make sure that when I get older or when I'm gone, that my family isn't just like, oh, those are worthless, because they look like they should be thrown away, but there's a story. So I'm glad I held on to them.